Hello, everyone. Welcome to another very interesting session that we're going to have today. My name is Abdel Jacobo Vasquez. I'm the academic specialist for University of Dayton Publishing at Grupo SM in Mexico. We really appreciate your time, you being here today with us in another exciting week. So today it is a pleasure and honor to present our speaker, Isaac Volado. He is right now on the camp today. I'm going to read his bio so everyone will know who he is and what is he's been working over the last years. Okay, so today your speaker, Isaac Perez Volado, is an academic consultant for the University of Dayton Publishing. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Texas at El Paso, as well as Cambridge, CELTA, and TKT certificates. He has worked in ELT and bilingual education since 2011 as a teacher in both EFL and bilingual programs in work history, rhetoric, literature, and exams preparation. Isaac has also been a program coordinator, teacher trainer, and youth group leader. His main teaching interests include assessment for learning, technology in the classroom, and experiential models for teaching and learning. Thank you, Isaac, for being here today with us. So we are totally ready for your presentation. And remember to comment on the chat. We really expect the interaction with you. So the chat is open for you to interact with us and work together. Okay, Isaac, all yours.
Right. Thank you very much, Abdel. It's a pleasure, as always, to be with Dayton. And today I will be speaking to you about a very dear topic of mine, which is readers in the classroom. So we'll be talking about what it means to be a reader. Specifically, we will be approaching it from a literacy perspective, and we will be touching upon what it takes to read, what it takes to be a good reader, how it is different for you to read in a second language than it is to read in your first language. Especially, you will be interested to hear in what are the best practices that we can have in the classroom as teachers. What are the best ways that we can support our students' needs? So our goals for today, I would like to as you're listening to me and reading the goals, I'd like you to think about what is the most important goal to you. I don't know, I'm sure we have a variety of teachers that are joining us today. We will have teachers who are beginning their career. We will have teachers who are far more advanced. You know, maybe they are in their 10th year of teaching like I am, or they've been, you know, around a little longer than that. And so we are going to have, I think, a little bit for everyone. There will be things that will make sense for beginning teachers, you know, maybe who just took their teacher training course or are just out of university. And there will be things that they might, you know, be worth reflecting on for more advanced or experienced teachers. So the first goal today is to reflect on the role of reading in the teaching and learning of English and identify strengths and areas of our development in our own practice. The first goal is for us to recall a little bit about the theory behind why we want to be teachers of reading as well as teachers of English, and also what are some of the areas that we need to keep strong. You know, what are the things that we should always be doing in the classroom, and maybe if there are any that we need to be more diligent about, you know, think about those. The second goal is for us to reflect on the needs of learners. You know, meeting learners' needs is paramount to effective teaching. It doesn't matter how experienced we are at teaching. It doesn't matter how well we do what we do, or whether our plan, you know, is a work of art, if we are not meeting exactly what the students need. So we're going to think about what the students need in terms of reading, what it takes for them to be, you know, supported adequately in reading in the classroom. And we're going to review some concepts and best practices, you know, things that we should be doing. Then the third goal is to expand on the set of tools. I'm going to mention some tools. We're not going to get to practice too many of them because this is a webinar and unfortunately the format doesn't allow us, but I will be sharing some links with you so you can try these, later in your own time, in your own practice with your students. And that is the key today. If you take what we learn, what we see, and you bring it to your own class, you will have achieved my goal, at least for you today. So which one was the most important? Are you more interested in learning about the theory? So that would be goal 1. Are you more interested in learning what students need, or thinking about what your own students need? Maybe that would be goal number 2. Or 3, do you want practical things? Which one is the most relevant to you? I think that should, if you have a purpose in mind, it will be easier for you to find it today in our session. Okay, so before we get into the nitty gritty, before we get into the bulk of the workshop today, I'd like you to have pen and paper lying around if you possibly can. The reason why is because I think we learn a lot more when we are doing something rather than just listening. So if it's possible for you, maybe, I know some of you are washing dishes maybe or folding laundry, and that's fine. But if you have, if you're sitting by your desk quietly, and you can get pen and paper, maybe you have a cup of coffee next to you or tea or whichever beverage you prefer, that would be good to have, and paper, because we're going to be making some notes, and these are going to help you enrich your experience throughout the workshop. So if you have those ready now, we can possibly begin. I will be giving some very simple instructions. These are also to keep us engaged. Sometimes I will ask you to tally, I'll ask you to keep count of things. I'll ask you to count how many, in a list apply for you, or maybe when we're reading a story, I want you to keep track of some elements. I will also ask you to visualize. I might ask you to close your eyes, and take a deep breath and go into, the depths of your mind and recall something. If you were not really into that kind of exercise and you just want to listen, that's fine too. But I think visualizing will make the experience a lot richer if you follow along with us. I will also ask you to write some answers. There will be, for example, a quiz in the middle of the webinar, which I will share with you. And I would like you to write down some of the answers, not all of them. And the point is not to copy. I think just as many teachers realize, copying doesn't mean learning. But what it means is that, there is some kind of reflecting about what the words mean, and then putting that down to paper. Sorry. And finally, there will be occasions in which I ask you to chat, to add to our discussion, to add to our group chat, perhaps, observations that you make or questions that you may have, which might be important to you. And those moments, I'm going to pause the presentation a little bit, and I will look at your contributions and respond to those for a brief moment. So if we are ready and all the instructions are relatively clear, I think, if they come up, I'm sure Abdel is going to, give me a little nudge in case there are important questions. But I think those are fairly clear. So I will be also sharing a website with you today, which are kind of our handouts. One of the wonderful things about working online is that we don't have to have papers, printed and lying around the classroom, and then, people throwing them in the trash at the end. You can just keep it nice and digital. So I made a little website that is very simple, and believe me, it saves a lot of time. It saves a lot of paper. What it has is our activities that we will be doing today. And I don't know, Abdel, can you paste this into the chat or share this in some way to the, if you want to also make a note of it from your own computer, the address is there, tinyurl.com/Dayton Readers. If you do it right, I'm going to try and show you now what it looks like. 1 second. So, I'm going to share the screen of what it looks like. So if you go into the address that you have there, you will see a website. It's very short, it's very simple. What you have here is the handouts for today. So the activity 1 is the one that we're about to do, Victoria's story. There's another activity later in the webinar, which is reading teacher self-assessment. And then the last one is the resources and references that I used to tell you today, about the topic. So if you're able to go into that one, you can follow along with the activities. You don't need to if these are sort of optional. If you want to keep them, you can just follow along with us if you don't want to download them. But if you do, you can follow the address that I shared, which I'm about to post once again, just so that you are able to see it. So here it goes, and we're back. So the address is tinyurl.com/Dayton Readers. In our first activity today, we're going to talk about what it means to be a reader in today's world. So the topic of today is readers in the classroom, and we're going to reflect a little bit about what that means. Who is a reader and what does it mean to read? Not only in the classroom where we might do it, for a grade or for a quiz, but reading in real life, reading as a person. And I would also like you, if you can, to tally, to keep a tally, maybe make a little count of the number of times that Victoria, who is the main character in our story, reads. The times that she reads a text and the times that she goes into a text somewhere, maybe to find information or to do any of the things that we already know people do when they read. All right, so let's hear the story. So if you want to put pen and paper down and start taking account as I'm reading, or if you want to read along yourself, that's also fine. I number the paragraphs there. You don't have to read the numbers if you're reading. I'm just going to go ahead and read the story. 6 in the morning. Victoria Reader woke up at 6 in the morning, as she usually does. She looked at her phone's screen and turned off the alarm and ignored her WhatsApp messages, and that kick-started her morning routine. She showered, prepared breakfast for her and her family, and sat down to eat, last as always. Right before she got up, her smallest asked her to sign a slip for school. "What is it for?" she asked. "I don't know," her daughter answered. "They just gave it to us." Flustered, Victoria quickly scanned the piece of paper to find the purpose of the notice attached to the slip. She was being informed of a parent meeting at school later that week. She quickly signed it, making a mental note of the date and time. Right as she was ready to get out, she recalled that she had no idea where her keys were. Were they in her bag? On the table by the couch? Somewhere in the kitchen? They were in her coat pocket. 6:55. She hurried the children along as they all made for the car. She checked her phone again. She was late, but only by a few minutes. With luck and some speedy driving, she could make it up. First, she had to drop off the kids. She got on her way and swiftly navigated the city streets, watching the signs carefully not to miss her exit along the freeway. Fortunately, she didn't. Not that it made a difference. A construction site along the way blocked traffic. According to Waze, it would be a bottleneck of 10 minutes. 7:30 a.m. In the end, the kids made it on time to school, but she didn't make it on time for work. As she walked into the office, almost on tiptoes, she prayed to God her boss wouldn't be there yet, or that he'd be too busy to notice she was late again. Lucky for her, he wasn't near the entrance. She said a quick hello to some co-workers and hurried to her workspace. 8:15 a.m. As soon as she turned on her computer, her boss showed up, right in her inbox. In an email timed 8 a.m., the time she was supposed to arrive at the office, she asked her to review a recent government report that had implications for the company and prepare a quick presentation with her findings, since it related to the work of her department. She had no idea about the report, so she Googled it first. She quickly went over the first 2 or 3 article previews. She never clicked on the first result, and decided on the article that looked like the most technical of the 3. The article turned out to contain a lot of interesting background information, so she clicked on a couple of the links to read later, with some coffee by her side, once her presentation was sent to the boss. Before that, though, she read the news article to learn the basics: which agency had written the government report, what the goal of it was, who was involved in writing it, which sections of the report she would have to focus on. She got what she needed and closed the browser tab. she was ready to dig into the report itself. All right, so that is the story. I'd like us now to have a little, a brief discussion. So how many times did you actually count? I'm gonna close the presentation and I'd like to hear what some of you have to say in the chat. So how many times did you actually see that Victoria read? Okay, I'm not getting any answers. Did anyone think that it was higher than 5 maybe? That it was higher than 6?
Isaac, we're waiting for comments, so let's
Okay.
give them some time to answer that answer. So I will publish them on the chat.
Okay, perfect. So there were some also interesting things in the story. Okay, so Elias from Ecuador is saying 9 times. 9 times that she read. Anyone have a different number? We have, okay, another user says that it's 8. All right, so 8 or 9. If we don't have any others, okay, we have 2 people who say 8. Okay, so we're gonna take those as guesses. We're gonna go back to the presentation now. All right, so if you notice, maybe one of the ways that you answer the question was by looking at the types of text that she read. And there were some traditional text types in the story. For example, she was sent a note by the school. She was sent a notice and there was a slip that she had to sign. That's a traditional text type. You know, a lot of parents actually have to read these every day and respond to them in some way. Yes, no, give a signature. There were signs along the road, you know, that she had to read, very quick bits of information that she could take and respond to by handling her car. There was an email message at her office, which is a very typical by now, you know, type of text. You know, a lot of textbooks nowadays contain email messages that the students have to learn how to read and respond. There was a news article that she looked up about that government report, and of course, the government report itself. She had to prepare a presentation, although she hadn't actually read it. She actually was supposed to write it. And finally, I think another interesting thing in the story is that there are some contemporary text types. You know, there are some types of text that people read today, which they didn't have to read, you know, only 20 or 30 years ago. So one, for example, she ignores her WhatsApp messages at the beginning. She had to read the directions and the signs on the map application, which was Waze. The results on Google are also their own particular type of text, and also the article previews that she used to decide which article she actually had to read. So she actually had to read a lot of times, and there are some interesting things about the story that I'd like you to think about. I'm gonna now get some of your comments as well. I'd like you to tell me what other contemporary text types do you know? What other things people read that don't usually come in a textbook? That you don't read a lot in maybe the textbook that you use at school, but which nonetheless people read. I'm gonna turn to the chat now and wait for some of your comments. So remember, the question is, what other types of text are there in, you know, the contemporary world that maybe we don't read in the textbooks, maybe that they're not so traditional? Ebooks, definitely. And if you think about how ebooks are different from regular books, you know, ebooks, for example, it let you navigate them. You have an index where you can go places. Some of the ebook apps have dictionaries integrated to them, which are very interesting. Ads, iconography, infographics are a very, very big new type of text. You know, a lot of students, for example, because of the COVID-19 situation that we're living, a lot of people get their information from infographics rather than traditional news source. Facebook posts, social media, definitely, Twitter. These are their own type of text, and people have to learn how to read them. You know, I recently read a story about, for example, a North Korean refugee. She went to South Korea, and the first thing she learned was how to use Facebook. But she initially began posting in her own feed, and it took her like 2 days to realize that she was talking to herself. Because believe it or not, we think of these things as very natural, very like, everybody knows how to, but it takes a while of getting used to. Emoticons are part of it. Instagram stories. Each of these different social media platforms have their own formats. If you write an Instagram post that's too long, you better make it personal, because if you don't, people are not going to read it anymore. TikTok has a very interesting type of writing that goes into it. For example, by synchronizing it to music and put it in different sides of the screen. Social media, YouTube comments, Flipgrid. Oh, I've never heard about that one. I'd like to hear about that one later. Very good. Okay, so all of those advertisements, yes. So all of those are types of text that we read nowadays. Now, going back to our presentation, what else is noticeable about Victoria Reader's story is that it's not true when people say that nowadays people don't read. We can't even avoid it. If you looked at the story carefully, Victoria woke up and she didn't actually wait a second before she was actually reading a text. She opened her eyes and the first thing she did was look at her phone screen, which contains text, and she looked at her WhatsApp messages, decided not to read them, but she couldn't avoid looking at the notification. Real life reading is a social act. We read for others. We don't only read, like, a lot of the times happens in the classroom, like, we read personally, and even then we read to answer to the teacher. We always read for someone else. And in the case of Victoria, for example, she read for her child in the case of the school notice. She read for her boss. And she also saved some of the articles that she found for herself. She said, I'm going to get a cup of coffee and read this when I'm more calm later. And I think a lot of us do that. Facebook, for example, now has a function for you to save articles to read later. If you've been on social media for a while, maybe you have a Pinterest account and you save them, and you realize that reading that happens for yourself is somewhat different than the reading that you do for others. Sometimes you read for ourselves because we want to respond to someone in a Facebook debate, but sometimes we read it because we find it interesting and because it's something that we care about. So reading occurs for ourselves, for our personal lives, but it also occurs as a social act. Before 9 a.m., a regular adult has read several types of text without intention. This is what we will call literacy. So this is important for us to think about. Literacy is going to be a key word today. And literacy in the way that we define it doesn't just mean that you know the alphabet. It doesn't mean that you just know how to read and write. Literacy means that there are things that you do with a text and that you know what to do with them. Because you are an adult that lives in a culture and that has developed certain skills. And those skills and that cultural processes are part of literacy. If you also notice in the story, different text types are read in different ways. The school notice, she read it very quickly, but the article that she found online, she read really deeply. She was looking for specific information and she knew what to look for before she opened the article, which is something that happens in the real world. When we read a text, it is actually very rare that you read it just to find out what's on there. You already know what you want and you already know what to look in it because you already know the type of text that you are reading. When you are reading a novel, for example, you're looking for characters. When you are reading a news story, you're looking for the who, what, when, where. When you're reading a notice from school, you're reading for, okay, what are they asking me to do this time? How much money do I have to pay? So you know what to look for depending on the text type. The purposes for reading make a big difference for how readers choose to read. Because of what we know we're going to do with that text, we make a choice of how to read it. And reader choices are critical to a fully developed literacy. This point is very important for teachers because a lot of the times we don't actually give students a choice. We just tell them, you have to read this. This is the activity today. You're going to have to read it for comprehension. You're going to have to read it for gist. You're going to have to read it this way because this is the way that we're going to complete the workbook page. And we don't leave actually a lot of choice for our students, which is something that we're going to make one of the big points in our webinar today. The fact that reading doesn't just mean decoding, knowing the letters and making the words. It also means making choices. And part of what teaching reading should be is teaching students to make those choices, what options they have, and what is the process to actually make informed choices like literate members of their society. That's what it means to have literacy. So now I'd like you to do a visualization exercise because we're going to reflect a little bit deeper about what it means to be literate. So I'd like you to take a deep breath and close your eyes if you are at home. So I just want you to focus on the sound of my voice, and I want you to take a deep breath. Breathe in and breathe it out. I would like you to close your eyes, keep them closed, and try to start, paying attention only to the sound of my voice. If there is noise around you, perhaps there is, some stimulus around you, try to shut it out for a little bit. Just focus on my voice. And I'm gonna take you back to your memory. I want you to imagine your memory as a kind of vault. It's a kind of place where you keep things in storage. And I want you to imagine yourself wandering in that place. You're walking around and looking for things. Maybe there are shelves around you. Maybe there are boxes. I want you to look for a box or look for a shelf in which you have the memories of the things that you have read. All the things that you read are there. Maybe your favorite book, your favorite novel is somewhere in there. Maybe the text that you read for, the last face-to-face class that you have with your students, you remember that text. And I want you to look in a box for a text that you had difficulty reading. This is a text that is in your L2, that is the language that you are learning. If you're a native speaker, this is a text maybe in Spanish or a different language. If you are a Spanish speaker, this is a text in English or another language that you have learned or are learning. What was the last text that you had difficulty with? What was difficult about it? Was it that, some of the words were confusing? Maybe they were words that you had never seen before? Or is it maybe that the words were known, but they were used in strange ways? They came in weird orders, or perhaps they were words that were used in a way that you didn't quite understand. Or maybe it was a type of text that you hadn't read before. Maybe it was a type of text that it was the first time for you reading. And so you didn't know how it was organized or where it is that you needed to look for the right information. Maybe it was a text that talked about a topic that you didn't understand. So try to recall how you felt in that moment. What emotions did you feel? Try to give them a name. Was it anxiety? Was it frustration? Maybe you felt anxious because you wanted to know what it was. Maybe you felt nervous because you had a test that you needed to pass, and that text actually, some things depended on you actually doing it well. Now, what you experienced there is one of the challenges of literacy in the classroom. Sometimes our students experience difficulties when reading a text. And you can open your eyes now. This is what literacy actually means. So according to one document by the Australian Curriculum Making Authority, literacy can be understood as having 4 dimensions. They call it grammar knowledge, which is knowledge about how the language works. So perhaps if a student reads a text where they don't know, some of the verb tenses that are used in the sentences, or maybe they don't know some of the order of words, maybe they haven't seen that a specific grammatical format or structure, that student is facing a challenge of literacy that is related to grammar knowledge. If the student is facing difficulty, perhaps because they don't know this type of text that they haven't read before, that would be what they call text knowledge, which is another part of literacy. Maybe sometimes the students find words that are unfamiliar or that are used in an unfamiliar way. And the challenges there are related to what they call word knowledge or vocabulary knowledge. They perhaps have to do with the tone or the register or the style. Maybe they are words that come from Australian English or South African English, or maybe a region in the United States. And so those variations of language may be a challenge for some of the students. And finally, there's also knowledge of how to support themselves using visual cues. A lot of the text that we have nowadays, for example, the infographics that you mentioned, contain visual information that help us navigate the meaning and the content. And knowing how and when to use those aids is very important to be informed and literate readers. So learning a second language and becoming literate in a second language also means that we have to develop all of these four in that second language. And when we think about what it means for you to have literacy in your own language, literacy in the L1, which is your native tongue, is normally the result of engaging with your culture. You have seen a lot of movies, you have read a lot of books, you have gone through 12 or 13 or 14 years of school in your culture, and so you have all this baggage behind you. And so it's your kind of like your award, it is your prize. You have this huge vault of knowledge that you've accumulated over time. And the more you grow within your culture, the more personal, academic, and professional responsibilities you have, the more literate you become. You have greater literacy. However, when you think about your second language and what it means to gain literacy in that language, it is not only a reward, which it can be. One of the first things that I was able to do when I learned English was read the Harry Potter books. And you have no idea how I love them. I was a teenager back then, and I remember I read the first book in Spanish, and then I was waiting for the second one to come out, and I could only find it in English. But I had been going to English classes for a number of years by then, and so I was able to read them without an issue, and I loved it. I loved, first of all, reading before all my friends, knowing what would happen, but also being able to do it. It was kind of a prize on its own. However, for many learners, as they are growing beyond B1 or intermediate stages of learning, literacy becomes a kind of demand. If you've ever taken a TOEFL test or an IELTS, you will know that in order to achieve the higher levels, you need to be very good at literacy knowledge. You need to have a broad vocabulary. You need to be familiar with a range of texts, different types of texts. You need to know different variations of English. You need to know strategies to help yourself, encounter information in the texts. For example, if you've taken the IELTS, you will know that one of the tasks will ask you to take information from a visual organizer, like a table. And in order to get a C1 or a C2, band 8 or 9, you will need to know these things. You will need to become literate. So it is a demand. In L1, literacy is sort of inevitable. In L2, it is required for you to progress, that you become literate. So what are some of the benefits of promoting L2 literacy in the classroom? We used to think, for example, or at least a lot of teachers still believe, that you need to develop language orally first. This used to be the case, especially when we thought about English as a tool, for example, for business. It doesn't matter that you know how to read a lot. All it matters is that you know how to negotiate. If you know the language to interact orally with people, that's enough. But nowadays we know that to achieve the kind of literacy that our students will need in the future when they are going to university, for example, or when they are engaging in their profession, with other peers from English-speaking backgrounds, they will need the kind of literacy that is only developed when we complement oral fluency and literacy. For example, when a student is able to see the way a word is spelled and they understand it, they are more easily able to understand new words that are pronounced similarly, or that when they encounter them in a text or when they encounter them in a conversation, they will understand them better because the more they have read, the more familiar they are with the words. It also increases exposure to L2. We know, for example, that in reading a single story, a student gains a lot more language because they pay attention to the actual lexes, the actual vocabulary, what words mean. We also know that reading supports learning of grammar and structures. And a lot of teachers actually intentionally do this. They will, I'm going to teach a tense, for example, the tenses, present tense, to describe routines. And a lot of textbooks, what they do is they will give you a text, a kind of story about somebody's day. And this is already part of our teaching culture. We know that texts are a good way to see the language being used in context. And so one of the benefits of that is that students learn how the language is used in context, and it models it for them. And it also can be a gateway to academic language development. When a student is continually engaging new types of text, they gain new types of vocabulary. And the more types of text that they read, for example, when they read text for their subjects at school, or when they read text about different cultures, they gain new vocabulary that will serve them to understand more and more types of challenging interactions and challenging texts. So these are all benefits of promoting L2 literacy in the classroom. Now, however, in order to achieve the benefits, we also need to be aware that students will have different needs. The needs of students in developing literacy in their second language are somewhat different from the needs that they may have when they are developing their language one. For one, for example, it means that they will require guidance and support, especially among young learners. So young learners are an interesting challenge because they are not only learning the language, they are also learning literacy practices. For them, it is not normal or easy to open a book and look for specific information. That is something that they will only learn as they see somebody else do it, as they have practice doing it, and as they are supported in the right ways, for example, through visual information, through songs, through activities that are meaningful for them, in order to develop those literacy practices. We also know that L1 literacy is deeply linked to L2 literacy. A student that struggles reading in their first language, for example, if there are Spanish speakers, a student that has difficulty reading in Spanish will have almost twice the difficulty reading in English. Although it can be independent for some students have very good literacy in their native language and not very good one in their second language. It is known that the more literate they are in their L1, that will support and be a kind of bridge that helps them understand the challenges of the L2 literacy. When you have a broad vocabulary in Spanish, that will make a lot of the words more easy to recognize, for example, especially in academic and professional texts, where a lot of the etymologies are Latin and Greek, and so they are similar. L2 literacy interacts with learners' identity. This is something that is critical for us to understand. That for students, knowing who they are is part of their learning process. Am I able to read well aloud, for example, is something that students take as a point of pride. When the teacher asks students to read out loud in the classroom, that not only helps you drive the class, but it creates a kind of emotional reaction in the students. Some students become very nervous because they don't want to be exposed. They don't want to feel like the teacher is making them is going to put them in ridicule because they are not very good to read aloud, or because they don't know the right answer to a question in the text. It shapes people's identity and their L2 literacy. And for example, if we give them a text about something that is completely distant from their cultural context, let's say we are going to read a text about cricket, the sport in India. Maybe the students have never really looked at what a cricket match looks like. They don't know what a cricket game looks like, what a stadium might be like, what are some of the traditions attached to it. So if we're going to give them a text in their second language about a topic that they don't really know about because of their culture, that is going to make them feel perhaps like the English class has nothing to do with them. And we need to make bridges between their experience and their cultural background and the literacy practices that we engage in the classroom. And finally, the last point here is that learners who are becoming literate in their second language, they need to become critical readers, not just users of text. A lot of what happens in a language classroom when we are working with beginning and intermediate levels is that we are so focused on the content of the text themselves and on teaching, that present, simple present for routines, that we don't have a lot of opportunities to reflect with the students on, for example, what it means for, what kind of a person might publish this kind of text, or for example, how can I use this type of language in my social media to describe myself. So or for example, what kind of details in a story might make it easier to understand or harder to understand. So this, however, we know from research is very critical. Learners not only need to learn how to read, but they need to learn what to read for and what makes a text good. So these are the needs of the students. It is important that we keep them in mind. So what are some of the things that we can do to shape L2 literacy? How can we do as what can we do as a teacher to make sure that our students are becoming literate in their second language? First, we need to recognize the needs of learners. We need to recognize that they will have different needs and what they are specifically. I think most teachers, regardless of what we are teaching, we should have an idea of which of my students need that extra support, which of my students are very good and need an extra challenge, and also what specifically needs to be supported about that particular student. We need to make conscious choices with regards to reading and literacy in teaching to support their needs. What this means is that when I'm teaching a text, I am not just teaching it to achieve to complete the workbook. I'm not just teaching it because that is part of my program. I am teaching it because I am meeting the needs of my students in terms of their development. I want to give them something that's challenging but not too challenging for them, and so I'm choosing this kind of text. I'm choosing this way to work with the text. I am choosing this explanation because I'm trying to meet my students' need and I'm trying to make them learn better. And finally, another thing that we can do is to create and to promote a literacy-rich environment in our classroom. I think you can tell when a teacher really takes reading seriously because of the way their classroom looks. They will have posters with reading strategies around. They will celebrate, the books and the stories that students have read. They will leave physical evidence of their interactions, the students' favorite characters, or they will have discussions in which students get to tell you which part of the book they like the best. This is what we call creating a literacy-rich environment. This is the classroom is a place in which people read, and when reading is valued, and in which reading is useful, just as it is in the real world. So these three things, recognizing the needs, making conscious choices, and promoting literacy-rich environments, are the three basic ways that we can shape the literacy of our students. Now, I've talked quite a bit for now. I would like you to take control next time. What you're going to do now is you're going to take seriously the first goal that we set for ourselves. We're going to reflect on the role of reading in our teaching and maybe identify some areas for development, because that's going to be the next part of our workshop. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes or so to do the next activity, which is a self-assessment. You will find it in the link that I gave you. Is activity 2, reader self-assessment. This is a list of 13 items, and I'd like you to write down the answers. Specifically, I'd like you to write down those elements in which you think that you could develop. If these are things that you are already doing all the time, so for example, the first one, I have a clear aim for readings in each of my lessons. This reading is going to be for developing reading skill, scanning, or this reading is going to be help me achieve for the students to practice simple present for routines. If you have a clear aim for the readings in each of your lessons, you don't need to write that answer down. I would like you to read and look for those that you believe could do better. Maybe you are not doing them at all, or maybe you could do them more. I would like you to make a note of those. So I'm going to give you some time to do that now, a few minutes. And I will be looking also at the chat in case you have any questions about any of the items. Okay, I'm looking at your comments, so I'm going to make a comment about this. Sinia Freire says their students read more what they like, for example, information that is related to social networks. She says that we must motivate them to read, focus the topic through technology, like a complement to take advantage of these tools, definitely. Like we said, for example, in the case of Victoria, she actually chose those articles that she wanted to read because they were of interest to her. And when we think about our learners, we have to think about what their interests are. Teachers, especially, I mean, I think at all ages, teachers have to be kind of hip, quote unquote. They need to learn what students are watching now, what they are interested in, and so linking texts that are related to those is important. So thank you for that, Zinnia. Kathy is saying that she thinks it's important to identify the needs of her students to learn new vocabulary. Yes, so one of the needs that will be very important for our students is the vocabulary that they have developed thus far. We should know whether they are familiar enough with everyday vocabulary or whether we need to, for example, focus on more academic, more kind of professional responsibilities, kind of vocabulary. So yes, definitely knowing where our students are in terms of that is key. Tanya says that she needs to work on 1, 3, 10, 11, and 12, which are, for example, 1 is having an aim. That is very important. Always knowing what we do in the classroom in terms, with the reading, what the reading is for. Teach my students different ways to read for different purposes. I think that one is a key need for most teachers. It doesn't mean that we are doing it wrong. It just means that we could do it better a lot of the times, because these are things that we learn and we do it ourselves, but we don't make it explicit for the students. We don't actually model or show them how to do that. 10, which is providing students ways to collaborate and socialize. Yes, these are very important because this will make it so that the text isn't just a chore. It's not just something that we're doing in the classroom. And 11 and 12, giving students choices for how they wish to read. This is, I will talk more about this a little later. And 12, incorporating extensive reading. I'll explain what that is in a second as well. Another teacher says they work with high schoolers, students who are good at monitoring their own comprehension, know when they understand what they read and when they do not, they do not. Okay, yes, so monitoring what they, self-monitoring is actually a characteristic of good readers, and we'll talk about that a bit further. Okay, so I see several of you are also looking at others. I review students' understanding. Most often they don't have good results. Okay, this is good to know, Moni. It's good to know that when you don't have good results, something needs to be done. It's important to make decisions while you are in the classroom. So that relates, for example, to number 9. We need to make decisions not only after the class is done, we need to make decisions in the classroom. So what do I do if I notice that most of my students aren't understanding? Part of it is planning. We need to have a plan B, but it also relates, for example, to thinking about what supports I didn't give and giving those supports at the moment. Elias from Ecuador says, my students don't have much choice in the class and there's a program to follow. That's a situation that most teachers are dealing with. This is true. The good thing is that they end up liking the stories and develop feeling towards their favorite one. That's good. That's good. And it's always good to encourage it. If there's anything that you will always get people talking about is themselves. So if you ask students, for example, to compare themselves to a character, to think about who they like the best or who their friends, look like, that will actually get a good result. So we have a range of answers here, more strategies to monitor comprehension. Okay, we'll talk about some of those. Okay, so one of you is two of you are asking about number 5. So I'll take a moment to ask about that one. Model reading and decoding to beginning readers. What this means is well, this is 2 points actually in one. So modeling reading and decoding for beginning readers and strategies for more advanced ones. So beginning readers are actually very young. what their key difficulty usually is actually making the letters that are on the paper and turning that into a word that they can hear and an image in their minds. So we need to model that. What that means is that sometimes we have to hold a flashcard in front of us or a book next to us and go word by word with our finger, letter by letter with our finger. L, like, showing them how it is done, and maybe engaging a few of them, doing it several times with each of them so that we model how that is done. And with the older students, it means, for example, that when we read a text together, or when I read a paragraph on my own, I also ask them a question that I would ask myself. So I would ask myself, why is this? Or having a way for the students to see what kind of questions an advanced reader makes themselves. Okay, and then finally, Alejandro is asking, what do you mean with different ways of reading? Different ways of reading means reading very fast to find very specific information, what we call scanning. It means reading, slowly and attentively, looking at the text, kind of like, looking for specific details, maybe trying to read twice the same paragraph to understand, what they exactly meant. Maybe it means using a visual to support our understanding of a specific part. That means reading in different ways. Maybe it also means looking at specific vocabulary, specific structures. What does this sentence in this paragraph mean? That's what I mean. Different ways of reading. All right, so let's get back. So each of us has different strengths, and I'm sure all of you have very, very good strengths, and all of us also have areas of development. These are just a list of things that we should be doing in the classroom. So the next part of our workshop is going to be about what it means for us to support the needs of learners. So when we think about the needs of a learner, we can think about Maslow's hierarchy, of course, thinking about whether they have, eaten that day, or whether they need to go to the bathroom, or whether they feel like they belong in their class, which is what they call, need for belonging. But in terms of reading specifically, we can think of what they call the cognitive model of reading, which is what happens in a person's mind when they are reading. I like to represent this as a kind of pyramid because each level rests upon the base. And the most important, or the key element of reading in terms of what students need, is word recognition. This is something that develops in young learners. Students that are 4, 5, 6 years old are usually developing their recognition of words. And this is the part that we need to be supporting the most for students. So, for example, we need to make sure that the letters are legible. We need to know that the students know what the letters are, what sounds they represent, how they sound when they are together. In terms of high frequency words, which are words that we see all the time, words like you, words like great, words like good, words that might have a strange pronunciation, but we see them every day, like the numbers 1, 2, 3, for example. We need to be supporting the recognition of those words. So maybe having flashcards around the classroom, having a routine where they sing it and look at the words every day. It also means supporting spelling, especially with the young ones. Making sure that students are familiar with frequent spelling patterns, for example, consonant blends, like the letters, what does it mean? How do we pronounce a word when it starts with an S and then a consonant, like spelling or star, how do you pronounce that? And phonics, also knowing how specific letters sound, especially for sounds that are very common, the vowels or some of the consonants that are most high frequency. We need to be supporting those. And if the students recognize where the words, how the letters make sounds and the sounds make words, we've already done a big chunk of the work. In older learners, word recognition tends to be automatic. Although, for example, if we have a teenager that is barely learning their first words of English, this might be a need that we need to support additionally. This is because they have learned to read in Spanish and they are used to the sound system of Spanish. They know how to pronounce each of the letters in Spanish, but they are not familiar with those of those more complex or even mysterious aspects of English pronunciation. So they look at a word and they know how to read it in Spanish because they are able to recognize the letters, but they might need to be supported by a teacher, for example, in terms of pronunciation of some of the words. Words like homophones, for example, they might need to be explicitly taught. High frequency words, it's the same thing we would do for a young learner. We need to supplement that for an older learner who is barely beginning to learn to read in English. So when I have a group, for example, of middle school students or high school students that I know have a very low degree of English in terms of their oral language and communicative competency, I also have to be very careful that I'm not just seeing that kind of lack, but I might also be seeing a lack of word recognition. And I think a lot of teachers sort of give it for granted that because they know how to read in their first language, they know how to read in the second, and this might not be the case in all cases. Second is language comprehension. So if I know that my student knows how to read the letters on the paper and they know how to pronounce the words, the second thing would be for the students to actually know what the words mean when they are together. It doesn't matter if they know how to read it and pronounce it if they cannot actually connect the words to one another and know that they make sentences. So a knowledge of grammar, a sufficient familiarity with grammar structures and with the order of words in sentences and with the type of information that is contained in sentences, through vocabulary or background knowledge, that actually aids comprehension. And sometimes our students are going to need to be supported in that regard. They know how to read, but they don't know the words that they're going to encounter, or they don't know the background of the type of text that they're going to read. So they don't know the kind of interaction between the characters, the kind of slang that they're going to use. And so they might need to be supported in their understanding of the language. And finally, the top of the pyramid, which is the let's say the one that is a need mostly of more advanced learners, is strategic knowledge. So as I mentioned before, when you're moving from B1 to B2 or from B2 to C1, when you're going from the elementary level textbook to the middle school or high school level textbook, one of the things you will notice is that you have more different types of texts. So if you used to have informational texts similar to the ones you had in the science textbook, what you're going to have now is yes, informational text, but also maybe opinion pieces. Maybe you're also going to have a request for a government office or for a university. The types of text are going to be broader. They're going to get more varied, and so we need students to know different strategies to understand those texts. What is their structure? Where do I find specific kinds of information? What kind of visual elements they will have that will help me navigate them? What purposes do I use it for? How do I organize the information if I need to write one? So those are what we call strategic knowledge. And those are usually the needs of older learners. They need to know how to become familiar with these types of text. So this is kind of our pyramid of learner needs. We need to be aware of which are the most important for my learners. So like I said, part of it is because of the age of our learners. Definitely, if we have young learners, word recognition is going to be key for them. But if we have older learners or developing learners, it's going to be a mix of language comprehension and strategic knowledge that they need to work with. Okay, so now, here's a list of factors that relate to the needs of your students. Here, I would like you to tally. If you have that pen and paper next to you, I'd like you to make a little count of how many of these factors do you think apply to your students' needs. So, for example, if you have very young learners, is that a factor that I need to take into consideration when I plan a reading lesson? That they need support in their word recognition. If I have a class of teenagers or maybe older elementary students, I will also have individual cognitive differences. This actually starts showing from first grade on, when we have perhaps, half of the group already able to read independently some words, and the other half of the group is sort of like lagging behind. They struggle with reading. This is often because of individual cognitive differences. Their minds develop, mature at a different pace. Some students just are, let's say, naturally more inclined to making sense of words. So that will be a factor in the needs of my students. Some of my students need that additional cognitive support for word recognitions, and some of my students don't need it. So those individual differences account for some of the needs of my students. Development of oral language is also important. So if my students, for example, are producing in the classroom, they are able to express themselves or exchange, regular conversation with each other and with you. That is actually a little bit of a predictor of how well they will be able to understand a text, but not always. So if I have a student that isn't producing, I need to take into account that, if I'm going to give them a reading that requires them to, read a long text without any kind of support. The literacy in our students' households is also a factor. It is known through research that most students who come from families that read at home, that have several books, where the family makes it accustomed to read or to read to them especially, this will increase a student's ability, for example, to pay attention to words, and for a student's ability to understand what the texts are for, the purposes for reading. Also, their familiarity with phonics, with spelling patterns. If your students are very young or they are beginners in English, that familiarity will not be there. So this will be a factor that you need to take into account. Their development of L1 literacy. One thing that you might want to ask your students at some point in the year is how many of them read books in Spanish or in their native language. This is important because the more literate students are in their native language, the fewer their needs are going to be in developing L2 literacy. We also have to take into account students' identity and self-esteem. We will have students that are naturally shy. And for example, if we do an exercise where we require them to read out loud, this will be something where we need to perhaps plan a little differently because they have a need for us to be sensitive to this. The social environment in the classroom is also important. Do you have students who pick on each other? Do you have students who respect individual differences? This is something that you need to take into account because we want our students to feel safe as readers. Background knowledge. If the readings that I'm giving them, for example, have relationships to topics that they are not very familiar with, this is something that I need to take into account. My students need to be introduced to that background before I go into the reading. Also, how well have they mastered those complex grammar structures are parts of the needs that I need to take into account. And finally, personal, academic, and professional interests. These are also part of my needs. So maybe you have already done your tally of how many of these factors you need to take into account. I think for most of us, it will be almost the majority, 3/4 at least of the factors that you see here. Especially if you're working with younger learners, a lot of the factors will have to do with that word recognition phase. If you're working with older learners, they mostly need more of the language development and also the social aspects of the classroom. That is very important, especially when teaching teenagers or adults. I have to be very mindful of their social environment and their identity. I ran into this text as I was doing research for this workshop, and this is actually a link it's in a link in your handouts. So what you see here is a quote that I think is very important. If a student can decode, it doesn't matter how much background knowledge and vocabulary he understands. He won't be able to understand what's on the page. But the opposite is also true. If a student can decode but doesn't have a deep enough understanding of oral language, he won't be able to understand the words he can say out loud. So this is just for us to keep in mind once again that the needs of students are going to be different. Whether a student may need to develop word recognition even if they don't need to develop oral language, and vice versa. If their oral language is not well developed, it doesn't matter if they know how to read the words on the page. So these two are complementary, and it's important for us to keep it in mind. So what are some things that we can do to support the coding, especially those of you that are working with young learners or beginning learners? We need to complement what we call phonics-based approaches, flashcards with letters and having students say the letter out loud, drills with pronunciation, with some word level recognition. They need to see that some of the words are pronounced, weird, in irregular ways, but they see the word as a whole. They are able to see it and read it as a whole, even if they don't read it letter by letter. Especially words that are high frequency can be recognized as a single word. We can model and read. We model reading, like I explained when we were doing the quiz, and highlighting word patterns and meanings. So when we are reading that big story and we look at a word that maybe we know the students are not going to know, we say it very slowly and we ask them to repeat it, and we ask who knows what this words mean, what this word means. This is very important to support that word recognition, because that will focus the student's attention on the way the word looks and what it sounds like and what it means. Introducing high frequency words in the environment and through explicit instruction. Like I said, having those posters around, those flashcards around, and also taking the time, to maybe teach it explicitly is also going to be supportive for the students. Using sensory pathways, for example, touch and movement to support letter recognition and tracing, doing the letters in the air. There are actually a few, a number of YouTube videos that show the students how to, for example, do a dance where they are riding in the air. Zainer Bloser, which is part of, Dayton in Latin America, it has a series of videos on that which are very interesting and which can also help the students become more familiar with letters and tracing them. Using routines and in context teaching of letters and spelling patterns. You know this if you are in kindergarten or in early elementary. It is very important that every day maybe we drill for a few months the vocabulary, the alphabet, the numbers, the vocabulary for the week, the vocabulary that we're going to be running into continuously in the readings and the songs. So those kinds of things, especially focused on the teaching of letters and how they are pronounced, and of spelling patterns and how they are pronounced, is ways that we will support the students in their word recognition needs. And finally, recognize the role of L1 in mediating literacy. The students might ask you a word, they might ask you a question in Spanish, or they might ask you, why is it that in Spanish it sounds this way and in English it sounds another? And this is important because this doesn't mean that they are confused. It means that they are understanding that words are made from sounds and that sounds can be represented with letters. And this is exactly what we want. So we shouldn't forbid them to ask the question in Spanish. We shouldn't forbid them from looking at the Spanish and the English together. Actually, this is a good strategy for us to, for them to start becoming familiar with some of the differences. Even coordinating with the Spanish teacher at the school is a good idea, because that will allow them to, to coordinate to teach these two things at the same time. All right, so what happens when the needs of our students are not related to word recognition, but rather they are related to the development of the language? We have students that need more vocabulary, students that need more, grammar understanding. We have to, when that is the case, we need to understand that reading often appears in our classroom in different ways. Sometimes we will read in our classroom as a skill. The goal of our class is for them to practice their reading skills. It's for them to practice scanning. It's for them to read for detail. It's for them to read because the story is going to be part of what we use for a discussion later on, but they have to really, really understand it. So this is what we would call reading as a skill. And then there are times in which we have texts in the classroom that are more as an instrument for something else. We will call this reading as a medium. If you've taken the CELTA or done the TKT, you will know this as the method of language through text. And what this means is that the text is there as a way to get somewhere. It's kind of like a treasure map. It takes us to how the language structure is used, or it allows us to see where the vocabulary goes in context. And so depending on whether we are practicing reading as a skill or whether we are practicing reading as a medium to get somewhere, this gives us opportunities to treat the support that we give differently. So just to make it very, very clear, when we are teaching reading as a skill, our goal is for the students to understand. We are using it as perhaps a part of a communicative activity in which they have to discuss or they have to write a reaction to a text, and they really need to understand what the text is about in order to do this. And also when maybe we're reading something that interests us, something that we find interesting for ourselves and that we want to learn more about. And this is reading as a skill. But then there's also reading as a medium. For example, when the reading is a way to illustrate specific language elements like grammar or vocabulary, or when reading is only one choice among many. And this is important. For example, if some of you are teaching online right now, you will recognize that you have options. If you are teaching online, you know that there are different ways to transmit the message to the students. Maybe I can give them a reading, yes, but maybe I can also give them a page from their textbook, or maybe I can also give them a video, or maybe I can also record a voice note and post it up on the platform that I'm using. And so I have different ways to convey that information, and reading is only one of them. So when this is the case, it is critical to know that reading there is more of a medium, and so supporting those students that are supposed to read as a medium is going to be different than supporting students who have to read as a skill. So to make that more clear, when we are supporting the reading skills of a student, it helps that we think about the pre, while, and post of reading. Reading, I like to think about it perhaps as riding a bicycle, which is also a skill. Reading as a skill is something that you can only become good at the more you do it. The more books you read, the better a reader eventually you can become if you do it the right way. Because you can get on the bicycle and not advance anywhere. There's also the right way to ride the bicycle. So when we think, for example, about how we support readers before the reading, one of the key strategies that is there for us to do that is to predict for understanding. For example, to predict for the purpose and the structure. This kind of text is, an instruction manual. This kind of text is a cooking book. This kind of text is a story that talks about an accident that somebody had. This type of story is about surviving in nature, and it's a story of one person that wants to tell you what it was like for them. So using that prediction, that understanding the purpose and understanding the type of text, for example, to infer structure, will allow the students to actually make a mental image in their heads, just so that they know what to expect. If it is a type of text that they hadn't read before, we might need to teach them explicitly, for example, the organization of the text. And we need to tell them, in the first part of the text, this is what you're going to read. In paragraph 4, this is what you're going to read. We need to prepare them for what's coming. We can also have them, read from textual cues. For example, read the first sentence and the last sentence. Tell me, what do you think it's going to be about? Or, there's a short summary at the beginning if it's a scientific article or something. I want you to predict what kind of details you're going to find. Also predicting from visuals, especially among young learners. We can show them that first page of the big book, and where they can see the princess, trapped in the castle, and we can predict, sort of make ourselves a story in our mind of what's going to happen. While we are reading, we can do some things to support comprehension. Some of you mentioned one typical way to do this is to ask questions, but I think it's also important to know what kind of questions we should be asking. So, for example, one kind of question that I like to ask when my students are reading is, or when we are reading together, is asking them to recall specific, aspects of the reading. For example, remember, when the character went into the basement and found a doll, or maybe reorganizing a little bit. So what happened first? What happened second? What happened later? So wait, was this before or after that? So we ask questions that help center the student's attention on the development of the text and the argument or the plot if it's a literary text. Inferring what's ahead, maybe asking them, okay, so what do you think is going to happen? Making notes is also important. One thing that I like to do, for example, when I read with my students is to have some kind of graphic organizer, kind of like what I did with you today. I ask you to tally some things, to keep count of some things, or maybe order your ideas in a Cornell format. Maybe have a graphic spider chart, but that helps you organize, the reasons why she went into the basement, and also summarize. Ask questions, that paraphrase what the story has been like so far and whether they agree. Sometimes using a wrong summary is kind of fun. Give them, oh wait, so she went into the basement because somebody was screaming in there, and then they correct you. They give you, the right summary of the story. So that makes sure that people are staying on track. And finally, another way to support reading after is by making sure that people understood after the reading. Personalization activities are important. So for example, we read a text and we ask them, what they liked about the text. We ask them whether they agree or disagree with the author, what they would do in the situation that the character faced themselves. We may ask them to change the ending of the story. Anything that has them, link themselves to the content is important, because that will also clarify maybe areas that they didn't quite understand. Also responding through speaking and writing. So maybe, write a short text, maybe talk to your classmates, maybe give me 3 things that you liked. If you don't think they can hold that entire conversation, just tell them, okay, tell me one thing that was your favorite, and they have to respond orally. So having those kinds of activities will help us support in their comprehension. Now, one of you asked, for example, what happens when I ask comprehension questions and I realize that my students aren't understanding? What we need to be doing there is to have a plan B ready. So hopefully you were able to plan for that lesson. And I need to ask myself, so if my students aren't understanding, what do I need to do? What should be my plan B? And your plan B can be any of the activities that you have on the screen right now with you. So maybe it can be asking a few more comprehension questions. It can be a visual summary, a graphic, organizer. It can also be, for example, having them reread, giving them some time to read 1 minute. Okay, so if they are not understanding, I'm going to pause the reading and I'm going to tell them, okay, look only at paragraph 3 and answer only this question. And I'm going to, give you 1 minute to find it. And whoever wins is going to get a sticker or a star, or kind of chop up the task. Make it into a smaller test for the students so that they are able to read in different ways. Sometimes some types of text mean that students need more than one chance to read. And one of the things that happens when we read out loud is that we only give them one. So perhaps the problem that is happening there is that we need to go back a little bit and chop up the comprehension. Okay, so let's focus only on the first paragraph. And let's focus only on this detail and this one thing that is the gist of that paragraph. So that will help us actually make sure that the students are understanding and respond to the feedback that we are getting. It is very important as teachers that if we have feedback, if we know how the students are doing, we don't just move ahead with the next part of the lesson. We need to respond to what we are seeing. The students need to know that we are responding. All right, here's another note. Another thing that we need to be thinking about is thinking about the way we read in the classroom. So when we think about reading as a skill, we often think about it in the sense of an intensive skill, an intensive reading ability. We are reading this type of text for this purpose because there is this test, or you have to do this communicative activity right now in the next 45 or 50 minutes. That's what we call intensive reading. And a lot of authors nowadays propose that we also try to get students to also read in a way that is called extensive reading. What it means is what Victoria did, for example, saving that text for later, that article for later, and she said, I'm going to read this with a cup of coffee, because this is very interesting to me, and I will read it in my own time. What this means is that we could also encourage our students to read instead of reading it in the next 50 minutes, give them the next month, give them the next 2 weeks to read a text, and specifically a text of their choice, a text that they like. And what we do for that, of course, one thing we can do is have a little bookcase in our classroom, if that is the way that we work. But another could be, for example, to also have readings online. The COVID-19 is teaching us to teach using online resources, and there are plenty of online readings. If you have, for example, a textbook that has a platform, you can have them go back to some of the readings that they did before or that are going to read later. If you have perhaps no good links of readings that for texts that are appropriate to their level and on interesting ideas, for example, Zainer Blaser and Highlights have one. And just have the students choose a text that you like. Choose one that calls to your interests, that you like the cover. Maybe it is about a topic that excites you, and read that. And what we're going to do with that is we're going to share with each other. Maybe we're going to have book presentations if your students are teenagers and are developing oral fluency, and you're going to have them talk about the book that they read. Or maybe they are younger students. Maybe they are, 4th, 5th grade. And so what we're going to do instead is a literature circle. We all sit in a circle, and there's going to be one class in which people are going to talk about their books. And it doesn't have to be this big formal thing if you get nervous. It's just, we're going to ask questions, and we all get to share, maybe using talking chips or some kind of talking activity so that we all get to talk about our book. In this case, we don't emphasize comprehension of detail or language like we do with intensive reading. What we do is we emphasize experience. So what aspects did you like? What was it like for you? What parts of the book were difficult? How do you feel after reading it? And we also, perhaps we teach them language before we do that literature circle activity or that book presentation. We teach them language that helps them talk about the books. So maybe we give them some structures. My favorite part of the book was the character I think is more similar to me is, oh, I agree with you. This was very good about the book. So we teach them structures, and we teach them ways to interact with each other that will help them discuss their book. We don't really grade or assess the fluency because we don't want them to get nervous about doing it well. Rather, we want them to communicate about what they like. And we encourage the students' choice of genre. So for example, choose a text, the type that you like. If you want to read an informative book about sharks, read that. If you want to read a story about a princess, go ahead, read that. And if you want to read a longer text than the rest of your class because you think you're very good, knock yourself out. If you want to read a text that is kind of short because you think that this is something you can do yourself, sure, go ahead, do a shorter text. But what it means is you give the students a choice. And if you want to take this a bit further is, for example, if you want to have the students maybe not talk about their book, but maybe make a poster with the favorite aspects of the book, and we just get to ask you questions about that. That's also a choice that we can give our students. Moving on, if we think about reading as a medium, maybe reading is my way to teach them the present, the simple present. What I need to emphasize then is that I can give my students actually choices. They don't actually have to read a text. Maybe they could actually listen to that voice note. Maybe they could watch a video. Maybe they can look at an infographic. And so we can give them a choice of text, a choice of media. They can also have a choice for speed. If you need to read this very fast and you think you can do it in 10 minutes, go ahead. Maybe I can, if you finish this activity, I'll have something else, or I can give you extensive reading time if you finish very fast and you're done with your reading the book quickly. But maybe I can also give you a choice. You can read this once, twice, 3 times, listen to it once, twice, 3 times. Also choose the kind of support that you need. If you want to have a dictionary, here it is. If you want to work with a classmate, for peer support, you can do that. If you want to use an iPad or maybe the computer in the classroom to Google something, you can do that. If you need my support, I can tell you what the word means, or I can give you, what is in the paragraph. Then that is your choice. And also responses to language. So because the reading here is a medium to personalize the use of the language, I can also give them a way to personalize patterns, maybe change some elements of sentences in the book, maybe noticing the use of the language in the text. Okay, so let's all pause for a brief second, and I want you to look at this sentence in the text and tell me, why is the verb after the have, for example? Noticing those patterns in the text is important. And correcting or extending the language. So for example, you give them a text that might not actually be correct, but that might be wrong. And the exercise is reading, but reading to understand mistakes. So this is a way that we can diversify our way of reading. And it's not just about understanding the text, but it's about developing the language through the text. And finally, what happens when my students are more advanced? If I have students that are going to start reading scientific texts, or they are doing TOEFL preparation, and I need them to learn how to listen to lectures and to read, a research article. What I need to do then is I need to understand that advanced reading is a skill that is kind of like carpentry. I have an image of a carpenter there, because advanced reading is something that you learn only by doing it. And the more you do it, the better you become. But it also helps a lot when you watch other people do it. So like I say, model those opportunities, for you to, finish reading a paragraph and say, okay, so a question that I would ask here would be this. Would you ask yourself the same question? Or why do you think I would ask this question? What is the essential vocabulary that I need to be familiar with here? And ask them to, read the text very quickly and try to recall what kind of vocabulary they might need. Maybe also modeling steps. Okay, we're going to read a scientific article. What are the first things that we need to do? Okay, we need to read the abstract. We need to try to look at the conclusion. Maybe I have to look at the structure of a research article first, where they show me, what goes first, what goes second, what goes next. What are some things that can only be learned by doing? So what are some things that an expert reader will only do, and that they need to try their hand at before we have them read that very advanced text? And also, like one of you mentioned in the chat, self-monitoring and self-regulation is important. And besides asking yourself, do I like this? I also have to ask myself, okay, am I understanding? Do I have this clear? This paragraph here, do I understand what it actually means? So I'm going to finish up with this, because I want to leave some minutes for you to ask questions. So these were the goals for today. We were looking at the role of English, of reading in the teaching and learning of English, and we identified some strengths and areas for development in our practice. We reflected on the needs of learners, which I hope you actually took account of what your learners needed, and what do I need, and maybe start asking yourself the question, what do I need to do to meet the needs of my learner based on the 3 levels of reading? And hopefully you heard. I know we didn't have a lot of time to explain some of the techniques, but I'm going to have time now at the end for you to ask specific questions. And maybe you heard about a tool or a technique that you can actually look up. Feel free to hit me up with those. I'm also going to share my personal email at the end if you want to ask a question, and you can feel free to do that. So I'm going to cut it off now. And before you actually are wrapped up with our workshop, please remember to enter our evaluation survey. If you liked the workshop that you saw today, please give us a good review. If you think there are things we could improve, of course, we will gladly welcome those questions. And if you are ready to do that, then we can start with the questions. Are there any questions from the audience right now?
Yes, Isaac, there are several questions. I'm going to post it on the chat, so let's see how many we can answer on the 2 minutes left.
Sounds good.
I don't know what's happening with my chat. Isaac, I'm going to ask you the question directly.
Sure.
One of the questions from Estefania Ojeda says, how can we apply these activities with students from school low levels?
Low levels. Is it students who are very low in level? Is that what you said?
That's what the question says. Low level students.
Yeah. I see it. Okay, so first of all, we have to understand what that low level means. If it's a low level in terms of decoding because they don't know how to read yet, or if it's low level because they have limited language development. If it's low level because they have little word decoding, then what we need to do is we need to model the reading for them. A lot of what we're going to be doing is not actually having them read, but actually reading ourselves, and having the interaction be about that. I am going to read with them, and what I do is I have them read with me. So maybe I do this individually or with a small group of students, and we go through the pages, and the focus is on interaction. So this is the story that we have today. And what we have to do with the students is, ask questions that are at their level, of course. So look at the princess. Is she pretty? Yes, pretty princess. What is happening here? And then, we read and we show them that we are reading with our finger. We go letter by letter. Of course, the first time that we read a text, we shouldn't be reading, letter by letter. The first time we just want, to see for the students to see the story. And then maybe other times that we read, we model that decoding. If the level is low because of their oral language development is lower, maybe they are older in age and they speak their native language well, but they need some support in terms of their low level. What we need to do is we need to focus on the right length of the reading. We need to focus on, maybe read only a paragraph, maybe read only a page, and make sure that they understand what they are doing. We focus on giving them the gist of the text, but then actually modeling and supporting these reading skills in a very short context. We don't ask them to bite the whole sandwich in one gulp. We go thing by thing. Let's see. We should have more questions now. Abel, can you give me the next question?
Well, Isaac, I'm really, really sorry, but we are just finishing because
okay.
the time is just killing us. But the questions will be on the chat, and you said you were willing to give your email address.
Sure.
So probably
I
they
will,
can
I will
answer
publish
those
it in the chat.
questions. Okay,
I will
perfect.
publish it in the chat, and if you have any more questions, feel free to ask them. Thank you so much to Dayton for having me today, and I look forward to seeing you all at another time.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Isaac, for joining us today. It was a very interesting topic. Please answer the survey. This is very important to us to improve and to be better every day. I highly invite you tomorrow. We had the workshop about 21st century skills at the same time. So be just aware of our social nets in where we're going to publish all the information about it. Thank you, Isaac, everyone. And for the rest of you who are out there, thank you for joining us. And we will be together tomorrow at the same time with the 21st century skills topic. Have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you.